More interest rate rises still likely despite today's sharply lower headline inflation.
Inflation is moderating in our economy. We've seen that again today.
The underlying inflation rate is stubbornly persistent. It's barely moved.
Lobbying firm Synergy 360 accused of planning to secretly funnel money to a coalition minister in return for government contracts. Victims of convicted pedophile Malcolm Leifer take the stand at a sentencing hearing.
That was the most stressful thing I've ever gone through, but I got tickets.
And Taylor Swift sends her Australian fans into a frenzy, with Swifties snapping up hundreds of thousands of tickets in record time. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Joe O'Brien. Economists are warning people with mortgages that more interest rate rises are still likely on the way, despite today's lower inflation. The latest monthly consumer price indicator shows inflation eased sharply to 5.6% over the 12 months to May, down from 6.8%. The inflation number is thought to have peaked back in December last year at 8.4%, but even this lower number is still a long way from the RBA's 2 to 3% target band. The data comes ahead of the Reserve Bank's interest rate decision next week.
We want to see inflation moderate, and it is, and we want to see it moderate quicker, which is why a central part of our economic plan in our two budgets has been to help people through these cost of living pressures without making the inflation challenge worse. So inflation is moderating in our economy. We've seen that again today. We want it to moderate faster, because cost of living pressures are still the defining challenge around the kitchen table and around our economy.
We do welcome the reduction in the headline number, but the underlying inflation rate is stubbornly persistent. In fact, it's barely moved from 6.5% to 6.4%, and that is real household pressures being felt by Australians. Sharp increases in food prices, sharp increases in the price of housing, sharp increases in the price of furniture, and so many other things.
Angus Taylor there, and now here's economist Sue Lin Ong with her analysis of today's result, and she's expecting that there are still further rate rises to come.
So what we have seen today is an easing in headline inflation. It has come down, helped very much by lower fuel prices, as well as an easing in the cost of holiday travel and accommodation. Plus some other components are not rising as fast as they have been. And here we're looking at things like housing and furnishing and the rest. So definitely a better outcome today. Headline inflation is moderated to 5.6%. And while some of the core measures have also eased to between 6 to 6.5%. That is a good outcome. Things are moving in the right direction. But I think what worries us is that these key core measures are still very elevated and well above the Reserve Bank's target range.
Yeah, so why didn't core inflation drop to the level of the regular number?
So what we have seen is really core inflation pretty high for some time now. It has eased a little bit here, and there's some various core measures, but it's definitely not benefited from some of the lower fuel prices that we've seen, and that's contributed to keeping core a little bit higher. We'd also note that some of the key services in core inflation are also fairly high. So when we look at rents, for example, utilities, electricity, all of those continue to rise and are pretty firm, and the worry is that they will continue to rise in the future as well. So core inflation is still relatively high. Like I said, it has eased and moving in the right direction, but we think it's probably still a bit uncomfortably high for the Reserve Bank, above 6%.
Yeah, and so a lot of the headlines around this today are saying this result eases pressure on the RBA to lift rates, but what is the likelihood of more rate rises?
Look, we still think the Reserve Bank has a little bit more work to do. The timing, though, is uncertain. We know for the last three meetings, April, May and June, the discussion has been over whether to pause or to lift by 25 basis points. And we've had different outcomes from all three meetings. There was a pause in April and then hikes in May and June. I suspect next week's meeting will be a similar discussion over whether to pause or do another 25 basis points. And so we are getting closer, we think, to the end of this tightening. tightening cycle, but there is a little bit more work to do because inflation remains high. The labour market is still extremely tight. Wages and unit labour costs are rising, and there is this added pressure coming through from rents and utilities. And so the prudent thing in our view would be to do a little bit more tightening next week. But if they opt to pause, and like I said, probably a close decision, there is still the risk of a little bit more tightening further down the track.
So how does this reflect on last month's decision to lift rates?
Look, I think the decision to hike last month was the right one. It was a prudent one. Inflation, while it's easing, is still very high, and it's too early to be sure that core measures will continue to move lower. We know that a lot of what drives core inflation is service sector, and there is a stickiness there because of tight labour markets and rising wages and unit labour costs, plus, like I said, those added pressures of rents. And so, for the Reserve Bank, as it's trying to calibrate the appropriate stance of policy, the risks to inflation still remain to the upside. It is prudent in our view to take policy a bit more restrictive. So it was the right decision to take rates higher last month, and it's probably still important for them to move a little bit more restrictive to make sure we get on top of this inflation problem, that it doesn't become entrenched and more damaging over the longer term.
So what's the key to getting services inflation down?
I think what we need to see is twofold. We do need to see a further moderation in domestic demand, and we're already seeing that. We know the consumer is pulling back. Consumption started to ease late last year. That's continued so far in 2023, and we'd expect further moderation in consumption and overall demand. That will be important, I think, in getting service sector inflation lower, as will some easing and loosening up of the labour market. Right now, we still have unemployment down near 50-year lows, very low levels of utilisation. We need to see a little bit of a loosening there, and that will also contribute to eventually some moderation in wages going forward. And so they're important components, I think, on both sides of the demand equation. So seeing some weakening in demand and also seeing a bit more softening up on the labour side to contribute to an easing in inflation over the medium term.
Okay, Sue Lin Ong from RBC, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
A Canberra lobbying firm has been accused of designing a plan to secretly funnel money to then Coalition Cabinet Minister Stuart Robert to help the company win government contracts. The former Government Services Minister and former co-owners of the lobbying firm Synergy 360 strenuously deny the allegations. Political reporter Cayman Gock joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Cayman, g'day. So how did these allegations come about? Cayman, sorry to interrupt. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, so we'll work to get that audio fixed and we'll speak to Cayman as soon as we can. New South Wales detectives have recommended William Tyrrell's foster mother be charged over the toddler's disappearance in 2014. Detectives have given a brief of evidence to prosecutors recommending the woman be charged with offences relating to concealing the boy's death. Leah Harris reports.
This is a decision that the detectives investigating William's disappearance have made recently to leave the case in the hands of the Director of Public Prosecutions as to determine what to do next. And this comes after about 2 years of them investigating this new theory they have, which centres on the foster mother having covered up his death after an accident. Now, this was a real change in direction for the investigation after a previous leadership on that investigation had said that the foster parents had been ruled out as suspects. That changed a couple of years ago when the strike force came under new leadership. They have since been looking into the foster mother as a suspect based on this theory that she covered up his death, not that she was responsible for his death. And all the evidence they claim to have gathered in relation to the foster mother has now been handed to the DPP. They will determine if there is enough evidence to lay criminal charges against her. It is important to stress here that that does not mean she is going to be charged. She has obviously denied any knowledge of what happened to William. If If she's not charged, it will then go back to the coroner once again to determine what happened to him. She has released a statement a short time ago in response to this latest development. She did say in that statement that her and her legal representative were not made aware of this development until it came out in the media last night. So through her lawyer, her statement has called on police to reveal all the evidence they have gathered against her, which they claim throws suspicion on her as having knowledge of what happened to him. They want that made public. They also want the DPP to basically make this decision as soon as possible about whether or not to charge her, and if they do decide not to charge her, they want the investigation to continue into what happened to William.
Former Sydney school teacher Chris Dawson has been found guilty of having a sexual relationship with one of his high school students in the 1980s. Dawson faced a judge-alone trial in the New South Wales District Court, where he pleaded not guilty to one count of carnal knowledge of a girl aged between 10 and 17. Jamie McKinnell reports from Sydney.
74-year-old Chris Dawson didn't deny there was a sexual relationship with a former student at the Northern Beaches High School where he taught in the 1980s, but he did dispute the timing. His legal team...